Good morning, and welcome to today's event, Strengthening U.S. Caribbean Cooperation on Natural Disaster Readiness. I'm Wazim Maula, Fellow and Lead of the Caribbean Initiative here at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. We're here for a very important conversation in a very important moment with a great lineup of distinguished speakers. To get us started, I'd like to introduce Ms. Adrienne Arsht, the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of both the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative. Adrienne, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. This is an important conversation. It's Friday, the 13th of June, which is 13 days into hurricane season. I remember when I moved to Miami in April of 1996, and the last weekend in May, the Miami Herald published a booklet, What to Do to Prepare for Hurricanes. And I went to my house manager and said, okay, let's fill the bathtubs. Do we have enough candles? And he looked at me, having been there for quite a number of years, and sort of said, we'll be all right. Fortunately, that was the case, but it wasn't always the case for everyone. And I have a pillow that says, we cannot change the direction of the wind, but we can adjust our sails. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today. There are things we can't do, but there are many things we can. And the highlight for me, aside from telling a few of my own stories, is especially that the Honorable Prime Minister of Grenada, Decon Mitchell, has had time to join us live. And so I won't tell too many tales about my experience with hurricanes. One dumb thing I did, I lived right on the water and I was 15 feet, the coral barrier was in my front yard. So I was safe from water coming in off the bay. And so I stayed in my house, and the eye of the storm came, and there was no wind, anything. So I went outside, and it was calm. The wind then picked up, and I thought, I better go back to the house. Well, by then, the force of the wind was so strong that it really took sort of superhuman strength for me to open the door to get back inside. I was trying to figure out where I could shelter in place. So these are so minor compared to what happens in the islands. Hurricane Beryl wreaked havoc, devastation. As they say, a hurricane may take 2 days to wreak havoc, but years to rebuild. And so the more we can do to prevent and protect in advance, the better off we'll be after the hurricane passes. And that's what will be shared today. I'm not sure about filling bathtubs with water. And I would again welcome the Prime Minister and hope that you and your citizens and country have been able to rebuild after Hurricane Beryl. And by sharing all of our thoughts here and yours, we will look to ways to better protect against the inevitable and share our expertise among all of the islands and even the American coast. And so with that, Prime Minister, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrienne, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for giving me this opportunity to join all of you this morning. The topic is obviously quite timely given that we are already into the Atlantic hurricane season and given Grenada's recent experience with Hurricane Beryl. And so what I hope to do with a short 3-page talk is to, in a sense, present some thoughts on the topic across borders, forging Caribbean-US alliance for hurricane resilience. We want to express our profound, I think, gratitude for the region, including the US, Canada, all of our Caribbean brothers and sisters for the enormous support given to Grenada, Caribbean, PT Martinique, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Jamaica, and Barbados, the islands that were impacted the most by Hurricane Beryl last year. Beryl, as we know, had many firsts. It was the earliest forming Category 5 hurricane, I think, in recorded history. It wreaked significant damage in the Caribbean, and it demonstrated that we have to accept the reality that there is an increased risk that storms will form earlier, will be more ferocious, and if we are not better prepared, will continue to cause significant damage and loss to all of us. And so the opportunity to share with institutions like the Atlantic Council and to hear from you gives us a good opportunity to see how we can further strengthen our ability to be better prepared and to be better able to withstand and bounce back from these disasters. So it's no secret that I think the Caribbean is clearly vulnerable to both natural and man-made disasters, and that we face a multi-hazard reality with a multi-island layout with increased risk and vulnerability. And I think obviously as islands, it poses significant challenges to us because to a large extent, there is nowhere to go when we are facing these risks and these vulnerabilities. And this is obviously exacerbated by poverty and economic circumstances. And in many instances, both are directly related to disaster risk. And the question our populations face is, can we afford the measures necessary to reduce risks and/or vulnerabilities? And as we know, climate change has a direct correlation with disaster risk. Climate adaptation is one way of addressing disaster risk, but it is costly, and it is something that the region has to grapple with. But as you are aware, the Caribbean, as small island developing states, have contributed very little to the growing climate concerns as compared to the large developed and the large developing countries. So we have increased disaster risk and vulnerabilities fueled by climate change and weak socioeconomic conditions that ultimately forces the region to choose between disaster risk reduction and economic development. But sustainable development actually requires advances in economic development and disaster risk reduction together. They go hand in hand. It is not one or the other. And it therefore requires tough measures to reduce our vulnerabilities, because if we do not reduce our vulnerabilities, we in fact enhance the risk, and therefore we also enhance the likelihood of the type of loss and damage that we will continue to suffer. And so engaging in disaster risk reduction is not an option. It's a reality that we must tackle with determination, strong political and popular will. And I want to emphasize the importance of popular will, because governments and politicians alone and state institutions simply will not be able to, on their own, drive the wholesale and mainstream approach to disaster risk reduction that is required in the Caribbean, and I would say certainly in the US, particularly for its coastal states. And so our investment in disaster risk reduction today ultimately is geared towards ensuring that we can sustain development and create significant savings in the future. So what are some of the things we must do? I think risk governance must be a priority. In many countries in the region, there is no disaster risk reduction legislation or policy in place. And if they are, many of them are outdated and perhaps no longer relevant. In Grenada, for example, we recognize that. And in 2023, we enacted the National Disaster Management Agency Act. And one of the prime features of the legislation is geared towards ensuring that we can fully transition what thus far has been a loose government department into a full-fledged legal statutory body that will have comprehensive legal responsibility for disaster management, both in terms of preparation, response, and the build-back process if it comes to that. Of course, in situations like this, change doesn't happen easily. It's not going to happen overnight. It may even be painful based on some of the decisions that we may need to make. But we think in the long run, we really have no option. And so we have to ensure that we have legislation, that we have the policies, and that we then have the plans that come out of these, and that will guide our efforts to enhance our disaster risk reduction approach. The second area is disaster risk financing. That area is still, one may say, emerging, but it is very costly. We accept there are significant benefits if one can afford it. And a perfect example would have been Grenada benefiting from the catastrophic risk insurance, which we purchased over the last several years, which gave us parametric insurance payments as a result of Hurricane Beryl. Now, I can see one may perhaps take a cynical look at this, because certainly it is expensive. You have to be able to afford it, and you have to be able to pay consistently every year and hope you don't face a disaster. But I think in Grenada's case, Hurricane Beryl and the consequences of us thankfully having parametric insurance, in my mind, should answer any critic who is cynical about the need to ensure that we take proactive steps to address disaster risk financing and disaster risk mitigation. The payouts were significant. In fact, they were the largest in the history of the parametric insurance in the Caribbean, and it had a significant impact in cushioning our ability to immediately respond to the hurricane. One of the major challenges that governments face is the need to have immediate cash flow just to deal with the rescue efforts, and in many instances, before you get to rebuilding, just trying to make things bearable for your citizens. And that requires the ability to have immediate cash and immediate resources to cope. And in the case of the parametric insurance, within 14 days, we had the payout. In fact, the funds were delivered even before some of the grant funding that was being pledged by some of our other partners and so on. So the need to expand parametric insurance is something that is critical. And one of the reasons for this is that from a private sector perspective, particularly the tourism plant, and the tourism industry, which we are heavily dependent on, in some instances, some of our hoteliers and other suppliers are becoming uninsurable, not because of their own doing, but because insurance companies are reluctant to take the necessary risk on insuring them because of the challenges posed by hurricanes and other disasters. And so taking a broader sector approach to insurance is one way to also help provide individual coverage, at least some coverage, for our individual stakeholders within any given sector. So in the case of Grenada, our government met parametric insurance in place at the national level. We then targeted specific sectors, the power generation sector, and we were able to procure parametric insurance under the Caribbean catastrophic risk insurance framework, both for the power sector and for the water sector. And in the case of the water sector, in fact, the premium itself was not actually paid until after the hurricane had hit, because we had literally just contracted a couple of weeks before Hurricane Beryl hit. We also have been able to get some insurance coverage for farmers and fishermen, and that also proved quite important as well. But there are major sectors that are still without coverage. And I highlighted, for example, the tourism plant. And while there is some significant private insurance in place in many instances, either because of issues of underinsurance or because of oftentimes the lengthy and sometimes contentious claims process, you may find that the proceeds of the insurance either takes too long or is too little to lead to meaningful recovery. So certainly looking at other options to expand parametric insurance, I think, is one of the critical disaster risk financing approaches that would be helpful. And perhaps therein lies an opportunity for greater collaboration between the coastal states in the United States and the Caribbean, so that we can see how we can leverage obtaining better terms for parametric insurance. And obviously, this means looking at risk transfer. And it requires ensuring that we can continue to educate our population, both at an individual level and at the national level. Many citizens of the region refuse to insure their properties, for example, home insurance, particularly if they do not have a mortgage. And so we have to be able to explain to them that we need to go beyond the question of a mortgage, but really towards a more existential question as to how are you ever going to save to rebuild a home which is usually a once-in-a-lifetime accomplishment or achievement. And therefore, ensuring that we can support an appropriate infrastructure that allows them to do risk transfer by doing things like having insurance, whether as part of a parametric approach or on an individual level, is something that we have to encourage. So we need to have greater buy-in for risk transfer. The facilities must be available, they must be affordable and accessible, and I think therein lies an opportunity for greater partnership between the Caribbean and the Atlantic, the states in the United States that, like us, have to treat with this issue. The Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, or CRIF as it's commonly known, has done a relatively good job thus far, but we see an opportunity for more to be done, for other sectors to be considered, and crucially, we have to think of our ordinary citizens to make sure that they too are not left behind. So the main goal of our disaster risk reduction strategy is to build resilience in our populations. And as part of doing so, obviously, the Caribbean Alliance is critical. We work closely with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and CDEM has been a crucial institutional support for us in Grenada and throughout the region. CDEMA's strategy impact statement speaks to safer and more resilient states. But it has to be resilient to all. And we have to ensure as much as possible that conscious efforts are made to reduce inequalities in society if resilience is to mean anything. And we have to make sure that our ordinary citizens, as much as possible, are also very resilient. I'm perhaps simply repeating what I think we all know. Certainly, we've had, over the last several decades, significant hurricanes in the region, from Gilbert in 1988 to Ivan in 2004 to Irma and Maria in 2017, and obviously to Beryl. We are constantly learning from these experiences, but it clearly shows the hazards are more intense, more erratic, more frequent. And so we have to make sure that we take a whole of society approach in addressing this. That means crucially the private sector, and I would also say crucially young people. Because if we do not have youth involvement in disaster risk reduction, they may not have islands, they may not have a way of life, they may not have a civilization, frankly, to look forward to. So the programs, when we speak of disaster risk reduction, must ensure that we target vulnerable communities. We must ensure that we target our youth. And so when we implement, we have to implement with our communities and not for them. Too many times, I think we plan for communities and not with them. And this is crucial, because if we do not have the inclusiveness that is required, we will end up leaving people behind. So we have to ensure that our programs or plans are developed, that we have emphasis on things like gender sensitivity, that we focus on vulnerable groups, that we think of our education system or healthcare system, community systems, if we are going to advance meaningfully with disaster risk reduction. So the progress that we need in this area, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, must be with cooperation and through collective efforts. And I think having a forum like this morning is therefore exemplary, and it must be commended. We have to continue robust cooperation and collaboration at an individual level, at an institutional level, and clearly at the political and policy level. So we have to ensure that we continue with a multilateral approach. I know in recent times there has been significant pressure about and on multilateral institutions, but I think it is particularly critical that when dealing with climate change, when dealing with disaster risk reduction, that we appreciate that a hurricane doesn't ever stop in Grenada or St. Vincent or St. Lucia. To a large extent, the graveyards of the hurricanes are North America. And therefore, we have certain things in common that we must all work together to ensure that we can reduce the risk posed to all of us by this. So we also have to ensure that the international resources which are earmarked to address issues like climate change and to address disaster risk reduction, particularly for small island developing states, is actually available. I think we all recognize that this has been a significant challenge for the small island developing states to actually access the funding because it's made, quite frankly, extremely difficult, extremely cumbersome and extremely slow. As small island developing states, we contribute meaningfully to the civilization of mankind. And as I've said on quite a few fora, if places like the Bahamas or Grenada isn't worth saving, I'm not so sure that much of the planet, therefore, will be worth saving. It's not just for those of us who live here, but for the millions of people who visit every year and who are trying to, in many instances, reconnect with themselves, reconnect with nature, and reconnect with the planet. So we have a vested interest in ensuring that we can preserve and at the end of the day, sustain the Caribbean and the Americas. So strengthening regional mechanisms for strategic planning and response has to be doubled down on. Now is not the time for us to be walking back regional cooperation or walking back the mechanisms for strategic planning and response. We also need to ensure that we do not allow political expediency to sabotage or make us doubt the fact that we need to be relentless in our pursuit of collective action to mitigate the risks posed to us by disasters in the long run. We have to move away from building back better. We really need to build to last. Disasters, in some instances, are, and in some instances, they are not natural. Hazards can be natural, or they can be induced or made worse by man. It is our actions or inactions at all levels that will determine the consequences we face from the impacts of these hazards. And so we have to continue to act together collectively with a resolute sense that the young people, the youth of the region, the youth of the Caribbean, the youth of the Americas deserves at least the same, if not a better future than we have enjoyed. And therefore, we owe it to them to make sure that we continue to build disaster resilience in a strategic, cohesive, and in a long-term manner to ensure that their lives, their livelihoods, and their civilization is given an opportunity to be sustained and to flourish as well. So those are my my talk, if I could put it this way. I want to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to share with you, and I look forward to hearing your contributions as well.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for those excellent remarks and for joining us virtually from Grenada. Your partnership has been excellent, working closely with your ambassador here in Washington, who is a good friend of the Atlantic Council. We look forward to working closely with you and him and your government and people for quite some time. We have an excellent conversation today, and we have an excellent group of speakers. The Prime Minister, kind of summed up the importance of this conversation by saying we need to move away from build back better and move towards build to last. And when we think about resilience, that is exactly what we're trying to get at for this conversation, but a number of different programs we have here at the Atlantic Council and the Caribbean Initiative. And for our speaker list today, we are joined by four excellent friends of the Atlantic Council, friends of the Caribbean Initiative, and the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. First, we have Ambassador Roger Nias. Ambassador Roger Nias has served as the U.S. Ambassador to Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean under President Biden's administration, and is somebody that welcomed us into his residence when we traveled to Barbados and really helped us advance our own programming and support for a number of different issues. We're also joined by Ambassador Sarah Lynch, who is the former U.S. Ambassador to Guyana, and has remained a great friend of the Caribbean. Afterwards, becoming the former civilian deputy to the commander of Southcom and foreign policy advisor, and has joined us here at the Atlantic Council for a number of different issues. And now that Ambassador Lynch has returned to the DMV area, there will be many more things for us to work on together. Next, we have Jillian Charles Galop, the Executive Director of Corporate Banking and Sustainable Finance at CIBC First Caribbean. We've been working with CIBC First Caribbean for a number of years now via working groups and other public events, and great to have Jillian on the call. And last but not least, we're joined by Shanique Albury-Smith, Deputy Director of the Caribbean Division at the Nature Conservancy, another great partner of ours. Send our regards to Rob, who wasn't with us today, but we look forward to working with you and all of you that are on the call today. So, the Prime Minister gave a great opening, right, on some of the things that we need to discuss, from disaster risk policy to disaster financing, parametric insurance, but also building for the future, getting young people involved as well. And I'd love to open it up to the entire panel to first think about what are some of the challenges that Caribbean countries are going to be facing during this Atlantic hurricane season. And also, what are some of the economic consequences, right? Because it's not just the landfall of a hurricane or a tropical storm or any climate event, but it's the aftermath that is always so destructive. And given that we have both regional experts, but also specific country experts, I'll first turn to Jillian, you, and then Shanique to kind of give us a regional overview. And then Ambassador Lynch will kind of turn to you on maybe some of your insights from your time in Guyana. And then Ambassador Nayas, given that you were on the ground in Barbados and Eastern Caribbean last year, you giving us that sort of Eastern Caribbean overview. But Jillian, over to you first.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Azim, for inviting us to participate in this session. And thank your team at Atlantic Council as well. So CIBC Caribbean, we're currently in about 10 islands across the Caribbean region. We previously covered 19 islands. And over the last few years, we have really seen the impact firsthand on the impact of the hurricane disaster in our communities. It's not something that we're not used to because we have been here for several decades, but we have seen the difference in terms of the severity of the hurricanes compared to, say, a decade ago versus what we have been seeing in the last 5 years. So to what the Honorable Minister indicated just now, apart from the tragic loss of life, as well as infrastructure damage, the economic impact on the region, whenever a disaster like that hits, is significant, and it could run into billions of dollars, not only in terms of infrastructure loss, but loss of economic activity. What we have seen in terms of that financial impact is not to one industry alone, but to multiple industries. So if you look at what happened in Kirikou in Grenada, it was a complete decimation of an island territory. And where we have seen that hit, that economic impact includes to our tourism and hospitality, which is usually the key driver of economic resiliency or GDP in most of our islands. And when there's a hurricane in the area or hurricane damage, it means you don't have the tourist arrivals, you don't have the dollars coming in. It's a significant impact to agriculture as well, another key area for the region. So it impacts our food security, it impacts the fishing industry. We saw that with Barbados last year when Hurricane Beryl hit. The most impact in Barbados was the decimation of the fishing industry and a lot of the infrastructure around that. And so those activities create job loss, because when you have a hurricane disaster and you have damage, sometimes it's going to take a while to recover, so you have job loss. And then small businesses like fisherfolk, their livelihoods are gone, and there's a whole value chain behind that's affected. So the reality for our islands in the region is that it's not just infrastructure impact, it's not just immediate loss, but we always say that if when there's a hurricane event, it can take almost a decade to recover. You almost lose a decade of economic development as a result of that. So those are things that are really significant. And on the private sector side, obviously, whether you're a large or small business, those impacts, many times you can see small businesses may not be able to recover, and that means livelihoods are lost. And one of the other things we're seeing, obviously, because of the impact of not only the frequency of hurricanes in the region, but overall globally, the impact of climate change, insurance is a strong mitigation tool for financial institutions, for investors, for business owners. The cost of insurance in all of our markets have increased significantly. And in some instances, the reinsurers have either exited or they have had limit caps on countries. So that is an area I would say is one of the areas I would would call an emerging risk for us that we need to be able to figure out how to manage. What are the solutions are out there that can help to deal with that. I would also say that apart from hurricane disaster, we are also seeing other impacts of climate change. So, for example, across the region now, the biggest issue we have is sargassum seaweed floating through, and that has a huge impact on tourism. Not only tourism, because when everybody comes to, go to a beautiful beach, but if that beach is impacted by sargassum seaweed, that's an implication for us, and there's a financial cost to that cleanup. So monies that could be utilized in other ways, other development areas, have to be going towards cleaning up that aspect of it. So those are things that, in closing, ultimately, that we need to think about. There's not only a significant financial impact, but there's also a real socioeconomic impact on the region. And it just creates more vulnerabilities for us, because if you look at most of the islands, most of them in our region are not investment grade. They have high debt already. Budgets in several instances where you have to redirect it to recovery means that plans that you have for either educational development, healthcare development, infrastructure development has to be redirected to recover. And therefore, this is almost like a vicious cycle that's being created, because you constantly have to be resetting to restart again. So these are just my some thoughts on what the concerns are, that we need to be able to consider the mitigation and adaptation strategies
Thank
going
you, Jillian.
forward.
I think, to sum it up, it's loss of economic activity across all sectors. It seems that, when a hurricane or tropical storm affects one sector, it affects all the others, and that contributes to countries' vulnerability. And then thank you very much for identifying a very important emerging risk, which is the cost of insurance or the loss of insurance. If assets in the Caribbean are not insurable, then those assets won't find investment, and we won't see development, especially infrastructure development in the region writ large. Shanique, want to go to you. Jillian gave a good overview of some of those economic consequences, but let's get some of your thoughts on not just hurricanes, but even other climate-related events that might be affecting the region overall.
Yeah, and thank you, Wasim, and thank you, Jillian. I appreciate being here today. And the Nature Conservancy sort of covers 17 countries and territories across the region. And so there's a lot that's happening in all of these countries as it relates to hazards related to climate change or others. And sort of building upon what Jillian has shared, I think from what I've seen from my vantage point, and I'm based in the Bahamas, so I am a Caribbean national, sort of in the midst of this, along with others on this call. I think some of the challenges our countries have as hurricane seasons approaches are, broad, but also specific. There are still significant challenges for countries with just preparing for storms, having the resources to get whatever kind of communications equipment, emergency supplies, the logistics of staging them at strategic points around the countries, so that if there is a storm, there's sort of a quick way of deploying those resources. And because the capacity of government, even though government leads these efforts, is limited, there is sort of a partnership that happens in each of these countries between like central government, local government, our military branches, civil society like the Red Cross, even churches, schools, and others, to sort of support disaster preparedness and like the immediate aftermath of hurricanes. So getting people ready and having clarity on protocols and roles and responsibilities, I think all of that preparation leading up to any event, and even in the aftermath, deploying and sort of bringing into reality the plans that have been made as hurricane season is approaching, is still a challenge. And building muscle in those areas and improving upon the systems and processes we have in place, I think it's a critical area that continues to need focus and investment from many of our countries in the region. And then I just wanted to highlight, you mentioned like there's hazards from storms and other hazards that may not be storm related, but there's even an impact when we have just the threats of storms. because particularly for things like the tourism industry, if tourists are hearing, oh, a storm may approach the Bahamas or Grenada or Dominican Republic in the next few days, they're going to cancel reservations, they're going to leave, whatever the case, and the storm may or may not come. You have disruptions in schools and businesses. So there's an impact that's felt that's even beyond a storm hitting. The preparation of the storm, the threat of a storm is disruptive. You can have multiple disruptive events in a short period of time in a hurricane season with at least 5 to 6 possible tropical storms of any sort. And what we're seeing in the Caribbean through our work in TNC and places like the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and other places, even if we don't get a major storm event, we're still seeing challenges with a lot of flooding because of even the weaker or smaller tropical storm systems. And so governments and the people in the communities around the Bahamas in these countries are really struggling with some of these impacts that seem maybe less acute than a major storm event, but are no less impactful in terms of the economic costs, the costs socially, et cetera, on various systems in the countries that we work. And I just also want to just highlight that one of the things that became apparent to me after Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas in 2019 is sort of the impact of these events on our medical facilities and services, as well as the sort of mental and physical health of the population in the Caribbean. We saw dramatic instances of bystander syndrome, I think, in the Bahamas from many of our citizens who were not on the islands affected by Dorian, but had to watch basically helplessly to see others suffering during the storm. For persons who were in those storms, any storm event, no matter how minor, it's a trigger. For persons who had such a dramatic experience, and long-term sort of support for them psychologically and otherwise, it's still a struggle for government services and other services to address. So these are some other things I think we need to be thinking about in terms of what we're considering as a cost or impact of these types of systems. And of course, I would be remiss without mentioning our natural systems. Obviously, in the event of disasters and storms, the priority is always on humans. But the natural systems, our ecosystems, natural environments are also taking shock, and multiple shocks in short periods of time, similar to humans, it sort of reduces the resilience of our natural ecosystem. So, TNC is very interested in the conversation around how do we couple disaster risk reduction with thinking about the role of nature and helping us with reducing risk for disasters, things like reducing flooding through using our natural and coastal ecosystems like mangroves and other types of wetlands, but also how do we ensure that we also try to support nature and its recovery post storms so that nature can help us in our risk reduction. So these are also some things to be considered. Yeah.
Thank you, Shanique. I think some key points you mentioned there. One is the resources that are needed to prepare for storms. Of course, using nature-based systems as a way to address some of the both slow onset and sudden onset events that result from changing weather patterns. But something really important that I think you mentioned that is not discussed as much, which is just the disruptions that occur to countries and their own economic activity just by a storm being named or being within the vicinity of a country, and understanding how, when we think about resilience, we need to factor that in as well. So, both you and Jillian gave great regional overviews on economic activity, emerging risks like cost of insurance, and a number of other issues. I'd like to turn now to Ambassador Nias, who was in the region last year during Hurricane Beryl, and would love to get your thoughts on how these are affected, how Barbados and Eastern Caribbean specifically are affected by hurricanes and other strong tropical storms.
Great. Thanks, Waz. And also thanks to Prime Minister Mitchell, who is one of my prime ministers. I had 7 independent Eastern Caribbean countries in my portfolio. So it was wonderful to work with Prime Minister Mitchell and his team, especially around the Hurricane Beryl response. I directed the Hurricane Beryl response with my team and the folks back at the State Department in DC, and we helped secure almost $5 million in fairly quick terms for both Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which were both directly hit by the Category 5 hurricane, and also Barbados, which had significant damage to the fisheries, as we heard. I am here with a little bit of a downer news. I think that the challenges are greater today than they were even last year. I think with the policy changes that are happening in DC, the US will not show up the way that it has in the past. And it's unclear exactly how that will look in the next hurricane. The elimination of US aid in particular not only affects real dollars, but there is significant disaster experience that has disappeared and it's not been replaced. And so that will have a negative impact on the region, especially in the coming months and years as new hurricanes emerge. I do think the Department of Defense, specifically Southcom, which Sarah Ann can talk about, can help, but it will not replace what we lost with US aid. I also think that, as folks in the Caribbean know, despite the heroic efforts of the US ambassadors who have fought hard for the region, it's not a high priority for the US government. It hasn't been in recent years, and it certainly isn't today. So the priorities of other issues will take center stage. So we have to find creative and strong ways of raising these issues, both with the administration, Congress, the private sector, and allies around the world. So that is really critical. I think that you're going to see hopefully more NGOs stepping up to fill the void with US aid elimination, and also multinational organizations. Like I just want to do a shout out for the World Food Program, which just opened a disaster hub in Barbados, which I think will benefit the whole region. With this pulling back of the United States, we are seeing China taking much more aggressive stance in this region. I think it may look beneficial to some of these countries in the region, but long term, it may not be. There are always strings attached to Chinese aid. It looks free, but there's always a cost. I would also say that it's a challenge with a new administration that there are no confirmed ambassadors in the region. We have a lot of very capable deputies, like my deputy in Barbados, but they're not confirmed ambassadors. They don't have the same authority. They don't have the same stature when dealing with important issues like a crisis, like a hurricane. So I think that the political chaos in DC is going to have a direct impact on how we respond effectively to hurricanes and how we prioritize our money. And I think that we're seeing this even tomorrow. There's a $50 million military parade, which I would love to be spending $50 million on disaster preparedness and resiliency in this region, but we just don't have those funds. So these countries, certainly the ones that I represented, are small and mighty. There are a lot of friends out there that are willing to help, and I'm happy to share some of those thoughts as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you gave a great compliment to the regional overview that both Jillian and Shanique gave at the outset, in the sense that you talked about some of the external policy forces that shape what disaster response might look like in the Caribbean, especially for this year and the next couple of years. Policy changes here in Washington, the role of China, but also the need for foundations and NGOs and MDBs to kind of step in to that role as well. I want to bring Ambassador Lynch quickly into the conversation, given your experience in Guyana, but also your experience at Southcom. Southcom probably is one of the most important U.S. tools for disaster response and preparedness in the Caribbean. And I know that a number of Southcom commanders are frequently in the region and connect consistently with regional stakeholders. So we'd love to get some of your thoughts on here, specifically on maybe what are some mechanisms or institutions like Southcom that U.S. policymakers can use to support resilience in the region.
Great. Thanks, Waz. Thanks for the invitation, and hello to the Prime Minister. I saw him at a number of different CARICOM events over the years. So great to see the other speakers as well. So specific, I'll start with Guyana. Of course, thanks for including Guyana in this discussion. It is a little bit different than the island nations in that it's much less prone to hurricanes than the rest of the Caribbean, but it certainly can be impacted by the heavy rains and the strong sea surges that accompany these hurricanes, which result in severe flooding. So that's really the issue that they deal with, especially in the coastal plains, which are very low-lying. And Georgetown, the capital, is of course in that low-lying area, and it's known to be about 6 feet below sea level, the capital city, and therefore very much at risk when these storms do come about. And its very survival is tied to a lengthy cement seawall that's a couple of hundred miles. It goes beyond the capital, but it was originally built in the 1800s, so it requires constant maintenance, and the survival of the capital is really dependent upon that. The government knows that. They've started to bring in natural ways of dealing this as well, which Shanique mentioned, mangroves. So mangroves play a big role in protecting Guyana and especially the coastal areas. The government's looking at gray-green solutions in order to add to its protection, and they're with regards to climate change, there are very strong indications that climate change is impacting the weather patterns in Guyana. Historically, there were 2 wet seasons and 2 dry seasons, but now it's all kind of mixed up. You don't know what you're going to get. It's much less predictable these days, and the storms are getting more serious. So there are intense flooding seasons and intense periods of drought, which can lead to wildfires. So there are these trickle-down effects of these serious storms and bad weather that should be taken into account. And regarding the economic impact of the flooding, I mean, businesses, while Guyana doesn't have tourism in the same way the island nations do, they do have ecotourism that's impacted. Other businesses, lose their goods, services are disrupted, farmers can lose their crops, livestock, and farmland. And then we get to consider its offshore oil resources. So that's unique in this region. And that's really fueling, so to speak, the development of Guyana and perhaps other parts of the region. And while the big vessels that are out in the offshore blocks working on the oil are made to withstand high winds and strong seas, it's something that needs to be continually watched because it depends on the severity of the storm. And of course, on land, these severe storms can impact bridges, dams, power grids, et cetera, which all impact business. And I just want to add that it's more than economic impacts. It's social and health impacts. If schools have to close, if clinics have to close, and people have to move out of their homes because they can't withstand the storms, those things need to also be addressed. And with flooding in particular, you have standing water. So there are waterborne diseases that can rise, like dengue, which already exists in Guyana, but it can really rise to a serious level if not addressed. So a lot of those things are impacting Guyana and Suriname as well, that are a little bit different, I think, than the other nations in the Caribbean. And how to address them? Yes, Ambassador Nias mentioned USAID formally being kind of, I would say, the flagship U.S. organization to address many of these issues in this region and around the globe. And with its, I would say, we'll use the term merger because that's what's being discussed right now, merger into Department of State. We're hearing that some of the capabilities of the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance may remain. So I'm hopeful that that will be the case and that much of the good work that's been done on programming and strengthening institutions that AID has done in the past will remain. But regarding Department of Defense, they bring incredible capabilities to these efforts. And I did just complete my time at Southern Command, as you mentioned, and so, just would like to give Southern Command a big shout out for all that it does to address these issues, to boost partner nation resilience and capabilities. And one of the most important things they do are these exercises, joint exercises. And the flagship exercise is Trade Winds in the Caribbean. And it's an annual exercise. It's taken place since 1984, with one exception in 2020. Because of COVID, it didn't take place. But other than that, it's happened every year. Guyana hosted it twice during my tenure there. And it's really an amazing show of camaraderie and partnership, not just among the Caribbean nations, but also Southcom invites other like-minded nations like Canada, UK, members of the European Union to work together. And one of their primary goals is to enhance humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So they work on scenarios to address those very things. So that's something to watch this year as well. Additionally, Southcom has established emergency operations centers and warehouses where they pre-position relief supplies. And so we're talking tents, plastic sheeting, jerry jugs, MREs. These are pre-positioned, so they're ready to go in the event that disaster strikes. Southcom also works with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who together with SEDEMA, they work to strengthen critical infrastructure in the region. They also do baseline assessments so countries can track their progress against preparedness. And then finally, I'll just mention the Southcom regularly just donates equipment to first responders. So we donated, while I was there, fire trucks and ambulances loaded with important tools and medicines, etc. Bambi buckets to address the wildfires in the region, things of those nature. So Southcom for this region, DoD in general, plays a very strong role in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your mention on Guyana, one is can never leave out Guyana, citing my personal bias. But I think it really does speak to the heterogeneous nature of the Caribbean, right? Stretching from Bahamas to Belize to Guyana, all the way east to Barbados. And when we think about building resilience, there's no one size fits all solution there, right? We have to really contextualize to the region. I like the point that you mentioned that it was similar to things that Shanique had mentioned, that climate change pervades all of society, not just the economic sectors. And then finally, understanding some of the important things that Southcom does, the trade wind exercise, which is very not just important, but very useful, emergency prep centers, donations, all of things also that relate to some things that Ambassador Nye said about China's engagement in the Caribbean, and understanding that there are still tools at the disposal of the U.S. to engage both pre and post natural disasters. So unfortunately, this time has flown by, and we've covered a lot of ground. But what I can promise is that this is just the first of many conversations that we want to have. We started first from the Prime Minister of Grenada, who really summed it up in saying we need to move from build back better, but to build to last. And I think each of you have captured that. Jillian talking about not just the loss of economic activity in one sector, but multiple sectors, bringing up the emerging risk of cost of insurance or loss of insurance. I think that is something here at the Atlantic Council we will try to work with you and CIBC First Caribbean on. Shanique talking a little bit about the resources of preparing for storms, but identifying specifically the disruptions that come both before a storm or if a storm never even lands. And it's something we'll need to talk about, and especially about nature-based systems, thinking about what's been done in Guyana, what's done in Suriname, especially when it regards to mangroves. And then Ambassador Nice, I think you summed it up very well, the policy changes both in Washington, but also globally, and how that might affect the disbursement of assistance, specifically real dollars. And then again, Ambassador Lynch, you bringing in your experience on Southcom. So once again, I want to thank each one of you for spending time with us. There's a lot for us to cover and a lot more conversations that we definitely need to have. So please be on the lookout via email for me to be able to reach out. I want to thank our virtual audience. Thank you once again to Ms. Adrienne Arsht for opening up the conversation, and of course to Prime Minister Mitchell for spending some time with us. And we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you.
Quiero que aunque norte y sur sean distintos.